First off, we're going to do a lot of coding in this course, and we'll be learning Zend by doing instead of talking. And secondly, as developers, when we sit down or take the time to learn yet another technology or language, we need to ask ourselves, what are the pros and cons to this technology, and how much time will I have to spend with it to be effective with it? Hopefully this course will answer that question for you, as well as give you enough coding experience that you can work effectively on a Zend project. First off, this course is not going to cover PHP and how to effectively code with PHP. If you've worked with any other programming language before, that should give you enough of a basis to get by with PHP for most of this course. As a developer, when you hear the acronym PHP, you may have a bad taste for it, or you may be indifferent to it or think it's great. Whether you like it or not, PHP is a platform that should not be ignored. This plot from the w3text.com website shows a sampling of PHP's market share as of 2013. It's used a lot, and it's cheap to host. It can be quick to build, easy to find resources that have worked with it, and scalable from small to large projects. Since PHP is alive and well on the internet, this course is going to cover one way to work with PHP that creates good coding practices, utilizes enterprise patterns, and takes advantage of PHP as a scripting language as well as an object-oriented language. As you may have guessed, I'm talking about the Zend Web Application Framework, which this course is all about. So what exactly is Zend? Zend is a web application framework built with PHP 5. PHP 5 became fully object-oriented compatible, and indeed, Zend is very OO in nature. Every web framework these days needs to have MVC, or Model View Controlling, functionality, and Zend has that. Web frameworks should also have a separation of tiers and are loosely coupled with the ability to plug and play components. Zend is good here too. And of course, we all want enterprise features like the ability to utilize relational databases, send emails and notifications, be performant, be testable, and so on. Check, check, and check for Zend. Of course, no framework does everything for everyone, so let's talk about some of Zend's dirty laundry. Because Zend is a full MVC framework stack, it can be a little on the bulky and heavy side. If you're building a one-page application, Zend might be a little bit of an overkill. I kind of feel like I should include check marks here to stay consistent with what we did above, so here's a check mark. Because Zend is wanting code developed cleanly and consistently, this requires some buy-in on developers to comply and learn the Zend way to build applications. This is a huge departure for many PHP developers who have been notorious for just throwing stuff together and frankly creating some awful code. So this may be a good thing in some ways, so I'm giving this a green check mark. If you're expecting Zend to be PHP's version of Rails or Django, you're going to be a little disappointed here. Zend requires building out more of the nuts and bolts rather than the convention over configuration mentality. This in itself has its pros and cons, but this does cut back on rapid application development just a little bit. I want to include an overview slide of Zend for somebody that may be looking at it from a CTO perspective or a higher level management. Keep in mind these points are based more around my experiences and opinions rather than fact, but may help you decide if Zend is appropriate for your particular organization. First off, you should ask yourself what kind of organization and resources do you currently have in your company. If you're a PHP shop, then you'll probably want to continue on, since Zend can help stabilize your codebase and introduce good developer practices. Leveraging your organizational alignment with PHP will be one less thing to have to retool. If you're not a PHP shop, you may still want to consider Zend, which brings us to our next point. Is your organization developing and moving as efficiently and quickly as possible? PHP resources are easy to find, and many already know Zend. Ramping up developers on Zend is not going to be as time-consuming as, say, a full Java stack or a .NET stack. Deploying Zend applications are also fairly straightforward and easy. Even if you're using other technologies, Zend may make sense to build small little supporting apps or other internal applications that complement your flagship product. Within the PHP world, though, How quick is Zend as far as rapid application development? Zend falls in the middle ground in this area, and plain PHP apps can be quick to build, but they often quickly become highly proprietary, and many become a tangled mess of code over time. Zend provides loose coupling and good coding standards in an enterprise way while still giving you the ability to develop features quickly. Zend, however, is not as quick as, say, the framework in PHP, or as quick as other technologies such as Ruby on Rails or Django with Python. So in summary, Zend is good if you're looking for a mature PHP framework that has been deployed and used in production by many companies. The developer base and community is thriving, and many third-party plugins and tools exist to help implement many common application needs. And last, the price tag is good since it lives in the open source world, and companies, however, do have the ability to get professional support for Zend via several paid service options offered by the Zend company. Okay, so that's enough of the manager and high-level CTO talk. Most of us are developers, and we're here because we want to learn the framework, so let's go ahead and get started with prerequisites and get our environment set up and installed. The good news here is that to use Zend, there's really only one requirement. You need PHP working on your development machine, and it needs to be version 5.3.3 or higher as of the time of this course publication. Of course, to run PHP, you're going to need a web server, and for this course, we'll assume you will be using the Apache web server. For our sample application, we will also want a database, and we'll go ahead and use MySQL for that. If you aren't already set up with these tools, we'll talk about how to get them in the next slide. There's so many different ways that you can install and configure a PHP stack on your computer that we could spend the rest of this course talking about them. Instead, we're going to utilize some of the pre-built PHP stacks known as a LAMP stack. If you have PHP installed and configured some other way on your computer, and you can install Zend in that environment, then feel free to use your own setup that you're comfortable with. LAMP is an acronym for Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. Most Linux systems ship with all these tools out of the box. So if you're running on Linux, chances are you're probably ready to roll. You may, however, need to check your PHP version. From a terminal or command prompt, simply type php-version, and if you're running 5.3.3 or higher, you should be good to go. If not, then you need to use yum or apt-get to update that particular version of PHP. If you're on a Windows or a Mac OS X, there are installers to get this same stack setup, hence the term WAMP or MAMP. Go to these URLs to install WAMP if you're using Windows and MAMP if you're using a Mac. For the rest of this course, I will be using MAMP because I'm running on a Mac OS X, but whether you're on Windows or Linux, you will be able to accomplish all the same tasks and configurations, but some of the files and folders may be named differently or in different places. Where there may be operating system differences, I'll go ahead and try to note them out when we are doing any kind of configuration that's OS specific. At this point, take a moment and get your LAMP stack installed and running before continuing on, and make sure that you can access your Apache server from a web browser. Okay, so really quickly, you can check your environment from the terminal if you're running on Linux or another system that you believe has PHP installed, and I'll go ahead and show you that. Before I do, I'm just going to show you my particular MAMP screen since I am running on Mac. MAMP is actually a little install that you can put on your system, and it tells you whether Apache and MySQL is running, and you can actually test it out and make sure that everything is installed correctly. If you're not using MAMP though, or you're using WAMP, you'll find something similar with WAMP, but you can also check this information from the command line by running php-version, and you can see I'm running 5.5.6 or higher, so I should be okay since we need to have a 5.3.3 requirement. And I can also check to make sure that I have MySQL installed and running, and I can check that by doing a -- version for MySQL, and I can also attempt to use the MySQL client, which puts me into my MySQL prompt. The last thing that I want to check is my actual application. Each LAMP stack may use a different port for your Apache web server, but typically it's either on port 80 or something like that. In my particular case, everything is held on port 8888, 48s, and I can test that by going to my MAMP context. So my local Apache responded with this particular page, and it says I've got MAMP installed and it's working. And if you're on Windows, you should have something similar for WAMP. And if you're on Linux, you should be able to access your Apache web server as it's configured. So hopefully you're at this point where you have a LAMP stack installed on your machine, and we'll go ahead and take a look at what's involved in getting Zend running on our LAMP stack now. There are a couple of ways that you can install Zend. You can download the framework and unpack it somewhere on your file system and then simply include it in your PHP's include_path variable. This sets Zend up as a global library for all PHP projects using that version of your PHP. This may or may not be desirable for your project and server needs. You can get the latest stable version of Zend from this particular URL. The other way to install Zend is to use the PHP Composer Dependency Manager tool and set up Zend as a dependency on your project. In my opinion, this is the preferred way to install Zend since you can embed the framework in your project and it doesn't depend on your server or PHP setup. This also allows you to run different versions of Zend on different projects. If you're going to run in a hosted environment, this typically is your best bet. To install Zend in this way, you first need to make sure that you have Composer installed and working. You can get Composer from this URL. You simply install with the curl command on non-Windows operating systems, and for Windows, there is an actual installer. Composer is essentially a self-bundled PHP application. You can think of a FAR file like a Java jar file, but geared for PHP. You can install Composer globally or locally next to your PHP installation. I like to stick it next to where I run my PHP commands so I can keep my options open and possibly use different versions of Composer with different versions of PHP on my system. Ultimately, you want your system configured so you can run the PHP command and pass it the composer.far file from the command line. If everything is installed correctly, you should get some Composer usage output similar to this. Before moving on with this course, make sure that you can run Composer since that's how we're going to install Zend on our skeleton application, which is coming up next. Now that we have all of our prerequisites and the Composer tool, we can go ahead and create our first Zend application. You can start from scratch with Zend, but your first application, you will gain a lot by using the Zend skeleton application. This is a bare bones Zend app that is wired up and ready for you to start coding in your custom application logic. You can find the application at this GitHub URL. You can download and extract this into your project directory, or you can use Composer to clone it. We're going to use the Composer tool, and this is the command that we're going to use. As we run through the project creation demo next, we'll go over what each piece of this command is doing. So let's go ahead and fire up our command prompts or terminals, and we'll get started. Okay, before we install the Zend application skeleton, I'm just going to double check that my PHP and my Composer tool is working. So I've actually navigated into my PHP bin folder where I have PHP, and if I just do this, I can access my PHP command. And then I've gone ahead and actually installed Composer into this folder. And Composer simply is just a FAR file that gets downloaded and also checks your php.ini file for some settings. But once you have it installed, you can simply just execute PHP with that FAR file, and you'll go ahead and get some usage output for it. So as you can see here, essentially I have Composer running and it lists a whole bunch of options. And one of these options is this create project. And the create project is what we're going to use to create our Zend skeleton project. So let me clear off some of this information so we can start clean again. And let's talk about the create project command that we talked about in the previous slide. So this is the command The first thing that I've had to do is I've had to add the sudo command onto my particular create project command. And the reason why I had to do that was MAMP installs itself into the applications folder on Mac OS X, which is outside of my home folder. And so as such, it requires some permissions that my home user doesn't necessarily have. So by adding sudo on there, I'll go ahead and get application permissions to write and do some other things that I'll need to run this command. Then you'll notice that we have the PHP and the composer.far in there, and that is just essentially going to execute the composer tool. And then the next thing that we specify is the create-project. That is the command that tells the composer tool what we want to do. And in this case, we're going to give it a repository URL of our Zend skeleton application that we have from GitHub. And the -s and the dev just kind of tells that URL where to go in the sub URL of that GitHub application. Because with a GitHub account, you can have multiple applications, and this is just telling it to go find a particular subfolder or application on the GitHub account. And last, we have the folder that we want to install into. And this is the applications MAMP area. That's where my MAMP is installed. And I'm actually going to stick my project in there. If you want, you can put your project anywhere you want. You might have a projects folder. You may have another area where you want to put this. But one thing that you do need to make sure is that wherever you're installing this, it's an empty folder and there's nothing in it. If you try to install this in a folder with any kind of content in it, the composer tool will go ahead and complain saying, hey, that folder's not empty. I'm not going to go ahead and install that. So let's go ahead and execute this command now and see what happens. I have to provide my password simply because I'm doing that sudo command. If you're on Windows, you're probably not going to need this, or if you're on Linux and you're installing this in an area that's inside your home directory, you're not going to need that sudo command. So you can see the first thing it does is it clones the skeleton application from GitHub and places it into your folder that you specify. And the last thing that the composer tool is going to do for you is it's actually going to install your dependencies. The Zend Framework has a way to add some dependency information on there using the composer tool so that it's going to install Zend inside of our vendor directory. And the last prompt it's asking for is if we want to remove any existing version control stuff such as your .git or .svns. And this is just something that it does to keep clean in case you are installing from an area where you're going to pull that information. In this case, I don't really care about version control system for this course, so I'm just going to go ahead and say yes. All right, and that is it. Let's go ahead and look at a file system now and see what actually happened there. Okay, so here's where my MAMP stack is installed. And inside of here, you'll notice that there's a Zend-app. And that was where we installed Zend to. If we look in here, we've got some content that skeleton app created. And one of the things that you'll want to keep in mind is that it has a vendor directory. And inside of the vendor directory, this is where you can have dependencies such as third-party plugins or other artifacts that you want to pull into your project. So what actually happened there was that when we cloned that skeleton application, we actually installed the Zend Framework inside of that application. As I said earlier, you could also install Zend so it's on the PHP include path, but it's kind of nice having it embedded in here because if you're going to push this out to a shared or hosted environment, you may not have control over that particular version of Zend or even having Zend installed at all. Our skeleton application is now kind of ready to roll since Zend is kind of embedded inside of it. So before we actually run this and test out the Zend framework, we actually need to do one more thing to Apache to configure this correctly. For the most part, to run Zend in development, you don't need to do much on the configuration side with your web server. However, to run your application and test it out, there is one thing that you do need to configure. That is the document root setting for your web server. Most PHP applications run out of the root folder of your project. And Zend is a little different in the sense that you need to change your document root setting to point to the public subfolder of your Zend project. From there, the framework will initialize and bootstrap correctly as you browse to your project. Since we're using the Apache web server in this course, we need to make that change in the httpd.conf file. If you've decided to use an alternative server like Nginx, then go ahead and make the change appropriately for whatever server you've decided to use. There are several ways to change the document root with Apache. In this course, I'm going to go ahead and change the global document root setting. If you're using virtual hosts, you could also change this setting for that host that you set up for your Zend application. What we need to do is find the following line in our httpd.conf file. Your install path may look a little different, but chances are, if you're using a LAMP installer, you'll see a path similar to this in your file. All we need to do is add a / and public on the end of the path and save the file, and we can now run our Zend application. One other thing to note here, if you don't want to edit your document root and you're on a Unix or Linux-based platform, you can set up a symbolic link to point to your Zend's public folder. Again, there are many ways to do these things, so go ahead and just pick whatever works for you and get your environment set up and test it out. Okay, so here I am in the root of my particular MAMP stack, and you'll notice that there's an htdocs folder, and this is where the web server is expecting all of our application code. But if you remembered, when we created our application somewhere else. And in my case, I put a zend-app folder in my MAMP directory. And so we got a couple options here. We can either copy the contents of the zend-app folder and put that in htdocs, or since I'm running on Mac, I can set up a symbolic link that points to the zend-app. Again, there's a million ways you can kind of set this up, so go ahead and do whatever works for you. I'm going to go ahead and remove my htdocs folder and set up a link that points to the zend-app folder. That way, if I want to switch out my htdocs with another application I'm working on, it's just a matter of updating the symbolic link. So, from the command line, I can just remove my htdocs folder, and then I can repoint at the Zend application. Now if I do a listing, you'll notice that htdocs is kind of in a pinkish color, and that's just telling me that it's a symbolic link now that points to the Zend-app. And I can get that info by doing a listing with a little more information on it. As you can see, it points to Zend-app. Okay, so now the last thing I need to do is go ahead and update my configuration so that we have that / public folder on our document root. I'm going to go ahead and clear this out, and then I'm going to VI the comp folder. So in my particular version of MAMP, the comp folder contains the configuration for PHP, Apache, MySQL, and all of that. So I want to go ahead and go into my Apache configuration and look for the httpd.conf file. Again, yours might be in a different location, but go ahead and find wherever that file is for your Apache server and edit that with your editor of choice. When I come in here, I'm just going to do a search for document root, and I found that, and as you can see, it's pointing to my htdocs folder. Or I could have told this to use the zend-app folder and then put the / public on here. But just to keep things a little consistent and kind of go with standard Apache configuration, I'll go ahead and add a / public on this and then save this. That's as far as configuration is concerned, but we do need to restart the web server. Typically, whenever you modify that conf file, you need to restart Apache. So I'll go ahead and I'll just use my little widget to do that here. Just stop the servers and then restart them. Okay, last, let's go ahead and check our Zend application in a web browser now. Okay, so we're going to navigate to localhost and our port 8888, and that should give us our Zend application. All right, so if you were able to get the welcome to Zend Framework 2, that means that you've got your environment set up correctly and your skeleton application's been cloned and everything is now running. If you got an error, you'll want to double check that, first of all, your web server is running and that you can make sure that you can navigate just to the plain web server. And if that works, you'll want to check to make sure that Zend got installed correctly. And the best way to do that is to just go back and run through that php composer.far command. So we've made it through our introduction, and at this point you've dipped your toes in the water of the Zend pond. To kick things off, we did a flyby of PHP in general in the market, and then talked about where Zend fits into that. We talked about how Zend is an MVC framework with enterprise features in mind, as well as how it can be a little more complex than other PHP frameworks and how that affects overall developer ramp-up time. We then covered the prerequisites to get Zend running and installed a LAMP stack on our computer. This consisted of getting the Apache web server, the MySQL database, and PHP all running and working together. Next up, we got the Zend framework installed and created a skeleton application that already has Zend wired in a way that we can just start using it and working with it to see how all the moving pieces of the framework actually work. And last, we did a little web server configuration so that we can actually run our application in a browser and make sure that things are actually working. And this was done by making sure that the web server's document root was set to point to the project's sub-public folder. So the fun has just started, so make sure that you don't pass go and are caught up with the course on your computer at this point, because in the next section, we're going to start getting our hands dirty with Zend modules and coding.